just pay attention to this. All right, finally, yes. Okay, so this will be a quick 5-minute demo talk. I wasn't planning on presenting today, and I'm sorry for cutting your breakout. But I was encouraged to show some of the cool stuff that's coming with ngAnimate. So I work for Google on Angular. I'm on the core team. And I work on ngAnimate, which is the animation layer on Angular. The stuff that I'm just going to show you briefly, so it won't take longer than 5 minutes, is 2 really cool features in 1.4 and then 2 really cool features that are coming into 2.0. So at ngconf, I talked about something called Animate CSS, which is an animation service that you hook in to your Angular application in 1.4. And what this allows you to do is you can control CSS animations directly, imperatively, mixing in styles and durations and all kinds of values 100% using JavaScript. And what that start function does is it returns a promise, which you can then hook into your JavaScript animation like so. So what 1.4 does is it blends the layer of CSS and JavaScript completely, and you don't need to have a separate animation library to run animations in your application. So what's next? Well, with this new feature that we had in 1.4, it allowed us to have some really cool features come around for, for example, how do we animate one element from page to page in a nice and convenient way? So here, for example, we have a home page and a profile page, and on here we have a link that you click on, and when you click on it, it's going to go to the next page in the profile page. So notice here how we have ngAnimate ref, which sort of ties one element from one page to another page. Well, with that in mind, we can add in some transfer animation code, and this is all in the Angular docs, by the way, so don't copy the code from my slides. It's all in the Angular docs, so you can see it there. And this will basically turn animations like this in an Angular application into stuff like this very easily with just one line of CSS code and a couple lines of HTML code. And this is in 1.4. This was announced in March, but it's been perfected, and 1.4 is in its RC, final RC. It should be out hopefully next week, any day now. So we'll see. Okay, so that's Angular 1x, and Angular 2x has a lot of other cool features that are coming, which are really cool. And one of them, which is my favorite, is custom CSS properties. So custom CSS properties, haven't really been implemented in all browsers in the same way. Like, if we wanted to have a property called ngAnimate, how could we do that? Well, on my blog, I wrote an article about how to do this. There's a hack that we can use in CSS. And that will allow us to have a property like ngAnimate, and we can declare all kinds of cool stuff in there. In this case, we're going to apply a fade class to all the children for half a second, and we're going to spread it out so that each child animates 100 milliseconds after the other one. And if you notice that the actual CSS code is very simple, we just have one starting class and one destination class. So here, for example, we have the template that it's going to get applied to. And that's an Angular 2 template. We have an if statement, and we have a class called myAnimation. And that leaves us with an animation declared 100% CSS that looks like so. And all it took was just one tag of CSS. So custom properties are also a really powerful thing to use in Angular 2 to sequence animations one after the other. And now let's talk about the final feature, which is a re-implementation of the JavaScript API for JavaScript animations in Angular 2. Here we have, for example, a page that has a series of animations. So this is kind of what we're trying to do. And here's our template. Here we have a body tag, and we have a bunch of if statements. And they all have the same expression. So when one if statement changes, then they all sort of kick in together. If we want to sequence it so that the child animation runs and the middle animation runs and the parent animation runs, we could attach a animation code to it. So this is what the animation API is going to look like in Angular 2. It's not 100% yet, but this is an idea of how it works. And then we use the power of annotations in our code to dictate, oops, that was too small, to dictate what CSS classes are captured and what animations are sort of sequenced together, and then we can use our own promise chaining code to orchestrate them at the same time. So that was just an overall sort of glimpse into Angular 2 and the cool features in Angular 1 that are around right now. Keep an eye out for this stuff, in the summer and the fall as it starts to reach Angular 2. But that's it for now, and we're going to do the panel now to talk about Angular 1 and Angular 2.
All right, thanks, man. So how this panel is going to work is going to be a lot like when we were talking to Michiko yesterday. We're just going to have people come up here and ask a question. And we have some Angular experts and Jeff coming up on stage to chat with us about, answer any questions you guys might have. So I'm going to put this right here. And anyone who wants to can ask a question. Okay. Alex, you will hold it.
Check, check. Check, check.
So I'm not sure who to direct this one at. My question is, when will generating API docs be an easy thing to do for our own applications?
Okay, so just repeating the question. So when will generating API docs be easy for open source applications? Is that
for our own applications?
Our own applications. When you say your own applications, you mean the web framework or whatever else you're working on? Is that? Are you talking
so we're writing a business application. We annotate it with things like ngdoc. Integrating with things like Jenny seem to be kind of painful now.
Mm-hmm.
How can we get to the level of your talk first say of quality in our own application so that people inside of our own company can then use our API docs?
That's a good question. So right now we're actually working on quite a few things to streamline the process for our own docs. So part of the Angular I/O site is to not only make it look and feel good and give developers a great experience, but also give developers that are writing the docs behind the scenes and the APIs a great experience while they're doing that as well. We're doing a lot of things to automate that process. And when we're done, essentially someone will run Jenny or command. All the files will move into the right spot automatically. They'll get styled. They'll get created the right way. It'll also add the proper metadata to the other files that's needed for the site to get built. And the developer won't have to worry about any of that. So I think the short answer is if you really want to make it easy for the developers that are creating this to write good docs, if you can automate that process but maintain the quality, then you have a good chance of doing that. And the repo that we're working on, it's open source. You guys can take a look at that. I think it'll be a good guide, or even use that. So, does that answer the question?
It does. Thanks.
Okay.
Yep.
If you haven't seen the tool we use that Pete Bacon-Darwin works on, it's called Dgeni, D-G-E-N-I. I think it's a bird. But that's what we use to automate our docs creation based on the annotations, and it's pretty pluggable and configurable. So I think it's Angular/Dgeni is in the Angular organization on GitHub, so you could check there.
Yeah, I've looked at that one. Ironically, documentation on this is not that great still. I know there's an example now, but if there was something for like a quick start template that made it a little bit easier to set up, I think it would be more useful.
Open an issue. Complain to Pete about that.
Awesome. Thanks.
So I've seen you guys have a bunch of meetings recently with like the React team and other teams. Why are you guys doing that? Like, what's the point? Like, seriously, I just want to understand
We're tricking them into trusting us.
Yeah, I mean, I know you did it with Rob Eisenberg, but what's the point of you guys meeting with everybody? How does that help?
We all have a lot of common interest. You know, we all have different approaches to solving different problems, and in that there's a lot of overlap in things we want to solve, like at the web platform as a whole, we want to see move forward both in the spec and implementations in browsers, as well as the libraries and best practices that emerge. So I think the more we can all work together, the faster we get these things move forward.
Is there something that you've wanted to add into Angular 2 that you just can't right now because of browser limitations? Is there like a killer feature that you guys really want to get in but has to wait still?
Pretty much like everything in Angular 2 is like surpassed the browser limitations. That's sort of, you know, why you see all the TypeScript stuff, why everything transpiles down to ES5. Like that's a lot of it was built with in the mind that like in a couple of years this will all be like completely like native to the browser. So we will shed this mind of transpiling and all this stuff, and by the time we get there, like seeing things like import and module syntax and stuff like that won't feel as kind of crazy, and it just kind of feels like second nature because we're kind of ahead of the curve in terms of ES6, ES7 even, and TypeScript and stuff like that. And I think in a couple of years we're gonna look at this and sort of seems crazy today, and it's gonna feel like right at home then.
Sorry about that. And as you noticed in the presentation I just did, you know, we might even have to add in some extra features into CSS. It's just something we're exploring right now. But you know, the goal is to provide next-gen experiences on the web without, you know, falling to the limitations of certain browsers today.
Also, we talked a little bit in our talk about not knowing much about the network state or other level status of the device, being able to know when it knows that it's lost radio connectivity with cellular or Wi-Fi, and being able to work with that. But those are being worked on. I think Ilya is working on some more robust network information APIs for the browser. So there's hope.
So I have a question just out of curiosity. You know, we've seen so many new tools coming lately, and a lot of the focus, you know, we see people asking questions about ES6 and Angular 2 and like this direction we're going, and all that's the core stuff that we're going to be looking at, you know, that we all need to learn and we all need to do. But aside from that core, things like Angular Meteor, Ionic, all these new tools and capabilities coming out, what do you guys think? What would you say is something that's just really good to deep dive into? Like if you had to pick one and take something and say, okay, I'm going to focus on this because I think this is really going to complement, you know, as an Angular developer, as a web developer, what tool, what we've seen today, you know, what we've seen lately, would you like first thing on your mind?
I think web components in general is a really great place to start, understanding shadow DOM and content projection and the other concepts that come along with that, and then, you know, looking how those are applied to Angular is a great background.
I would really start like getting into TypeScript, because anything that you learn in TypeScript will eventually be all in ES6. So it's a way to kind of get going with that. And TypeScript's code emission is really clean, like very, very minimal runtime. And sometimes like the code that you see emitted from TypeScript is like better JavaScript code than like I would write myself. So they do a really good job. And then, so like I would start writing JavaScript and then copy and paste that into a TypeScript file and then watch it pick up the errors that you didn't know you wrote. Because I do that all the time, and it tells you before you even ran, this is going to be a problem. And you kind of learn from just doing regular JavaScript into TypeScript how helpful it can really be. So it seems sort of like an encumbrance at first, but it's kind of like writing unit tests. So you say like, oh, this is a total, like this is a waste of time. But then as your project grows, you're like, oh my gosh, we need unit tests. So TypeScript is really helpful as you're building through applications, even small, even big. So I would start there. And on the data side of things, I guess I'm a little biased because I work on Firebase, but like I think that you should start getting away from this whole request response model and start focusing on like a more streaming model, like using WebSockets or any time of activity where you can establish a persistent connection from your client to your server, pass data like bidirectionally, and not have to worry about polling a database for updates, and think about how a database can tell you that it's updated and how you can respond to those changes. And that's where you've seen things like observables really play well into that. So as you kind of like start using these new technologies, you start seeing like, oh, like how do I handle this? Oh, observables work really well for this. So you start seeing why this is all really useful.
Awesome, thank you.
I have one more for you. It's something I don't think a lot of people deep dive into is just how to unit test better. Like if you have an if statement with 3 variables in it, really you have 8 different possible ways that thing can be executed. So a lot of people just go true or false. Does it execute or does it not execute? But a lot of times those things actually have much further implications in your code. So 100% coverage doesn't mean your program's bug-free. It just means you've ran over the lines. It doesn't mean you've actually tested them well. So defining input space, output space, like boundary conditions, really thinking about those and kind of understanding unit test from a bigger perspective, I think will really help going forward.
Hey guys, I've read a bunch of like blog articles about developer fatigue, the fact that we're kind of being overwhelmed by amazing technologies, and in our jobs we need to choose which ones we want to use, not just kind of develop the next one. So what would you recommend to members of the community when it comes time to actually choose the technologies that we're going to move forward with and make those decisions on behalf of our personal projects and our companies and things like that?
So this is something that I just recently did with my team. I think it depends on what you're trying to build, obviously. That's really important when you're picking a technology, to just not pick one blindly, but to actually think about the scope of your project, what you're trying to accomplish, and then spending some time doing some research. You know, take the time to actually look at the different JavaScript frameworks out there. Use them. If it takes a few days and this is something that you're going to use for the next 2 years, which is very likely, it's probably worth the investment. Does that kind of answer it? Or?
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, just like echoing what Alex said, like really focus on something like what do you need to build? Do the research on that, see what's best out there, make your decision and go for it, and just sort of tune out the rest of the noise and like focus on what works well for you, and that way you won't get fatigued because you're just confident that you made the best decision for you. And if somebody disagrees with that, you have done the research. You can say like, no, this is what worked for me.
Also pay attention to GitHub to see the activity on whatever tools you choose. Because you could find something that's really cool, but if there's like no activity, if it's been abandoned for a couple of years, there's probably no chance that it will pick up. So pay attention to which tools are popular.
Cool. All right, thanks.
I have one more, sorry. Depth versus breadth, really, I think it's very easy to take a social media approach to this, just grab a little bit of information from here, from there, but it doesn't really produce anything for you. Knowing how to display something in 4 different frameworks don't help you. Like really diving deep into one of them, I think, is a much better approach than just knowing the basics.
Hi guys. I have a question mostly around the documentation. And we heard a lot about developers being overwhelmed about all that is happening. We also heard like a lot of new stuff, cool stuff, awesome, that's coming out. And something that's really made me like the light goes up. Like your presentation about the documentation and how you're taking the general like primary action, secondary action approach for determining like what the users are actually looking for, even when it comes down to developers, because after all, developers are human beings, right? Mm-hmm. So, I'm surprised that it took so many years for the documentation to get to the point where, hello, we have a huge community, let's make their work better. So good job on that. Great. I'm very pleased to see that.
Thank you.
We're talking about a lot of implementation and incorporation of other libraries. Have you guys thought about a concept that is brought by IDEO about an effective UI? One of the presenters that we're talking about was human-centered design, which I think is like something that you're trying to incorporate with the documentation. So have you guys thought of working closely with companies like that that think, like, really will push your product? Doesn't matter whether it's something that is user that doesn't know programming or knows programming or just user in general.
Right.
Have you guys thought of anything?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that obviously I think if there's someone that has good information or good ideas, I'd love to hear them. Definitely open to that. I think a lot of the things that I presented today, those are things that I picked up over the years, listening to really smart people, incorporating some of those things, looking at some design philosophies that worked and some that didn't work. Some of them are just fundamental, and they'll work for anything. They'll work for developers. They'll work for regular consumers. I think the reason why documentation's been neglected for so long is it's not very sexy, right? It's not this fun thing that everyone dreams about building, but it is something that can probably have the most impact on your platform because that's where people spend the most time. Mm-hmm. So if you really want to make people happy, like I said in the talk, give them a great experience. You know, make them feel some really good emotions, you know, absolutely. Positive emotions when they're there. And yeah, I think you'll have some pretty good documentation if you can do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I know you talked a little bit about that with your meeting with React, and I saw you released the notes, but are there like specific big stuff that you like learned from them or then learned from us that you can share? I'd say like change detection in Angular 2 is pretty close to their flow of data in React, the directed acyclic graph. I think that was inspired heavily. In the meeting, there were notes of things that we want to collaborate on further, like performance, measurement, and what's that? Oh yeah, like native support for yeah. So like they have their native approach, and we've been looking at it, and their like Telerik is working on their native scripts. So there's a lot of interest in that as well. And I think somebody presented on our abstraction between application, runtime, and rendering, and so that's something we're looking at as well. Off the top of my head, I don't remember other concepts like that. Oh, the rendering abstraction is one example where I think they kind of paved the way on that with their virtual DOM, and that generated a lot of excitement in the community, and we looked at that as well. We don't have something like that, but we have similar abstractions, or we abstract in a similar way. Anything else? Joffer?
Yeah, I just want to add more of a question to that because I'm not really an Angular 2 expert. I know about reactive programming, but I've been working with you guys on the reactive programming stuff. In terms of, would you say the unidirectional data flow was also sort of inspired by their ideas around React's ideas? Because I think that's a big change versus Angular 2 or Angular 1 versus 2. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah. Gotcha.
Has there been any plans for, now that TypeScript has become what you guys are investing in, creating better tools around TypeScript debugging and basically anything related to that, because mobile and et cetera?
One thing I do want to say is that I've been using TypeScript for years now because I thought I came from like C# background, and so I thought it was really great to bring that down to the client. And for a while, the biggest Achilles heel for TypeScript was the fact that like if you were using Visual Studio, it was great, but after that, the tooling was just scarce. And since then, there's been a lot of really great open source initiatives for that. Like for the Atom editor, there's Atom TypeScript, which is amazing. And also, the TypeScript team has released the official Sublime text editor. And also with the new VS Code, which is like Microsoft's like multi-platform, like sort of like Sublime text, and Visual Studio had a baby editor. And that it allows you to do like breakpoints. It does all the IntelliSense for even if you're doing JavaScript and not TypeScript, it does stuff. So the tooling is getting better. As we speak, there's somebody working on it right now. So there's a lot of cool tools you can go and check out for that.
Yeah, so we collaborate pretty closely with them, and we give them a lot of feedback on things we'd like to see. And we also work with other tool editors, IDEs like WebStorm, and people who work on these problems to try to make an overall general Angular tooling experience better in these tools. And a lot of the designs with Angular 2, like annotations being statically analyzable, provide a lot more opportunity for these tools to give more insight for better refactoring and better auto-completion when building Angular apps. So that's something we're looking at a lot constantly.
And actually, like as he said, with like annotations being statically analyzable, but if you've seen the new template syntax, how you can use a # to create a local variable in your template, and the main concept behind that is that tools can take that, and they know that that # denotes a new variable, and then from there in your editor, you could when they see that, you will actually get better code completion and better symbol recognition from that. So there's actual like things that we're thinking about in Angular 2 that make it easier for the actual tool makers as well.
So there's a really serious dichotomy in authoring Angular 2 between authoring NES5 and authoring NES6 or TypeScript or anything else. Right? And I won't pass any judgments about the experiences, but I will say there's significantly different experiences. What did you guys feel on the net effect that that is going to have on Angular 2 adoption, ES6 adoption, TypeScript adoption, etc.?
So as you saw today, like in my talk, the last part of it was all ES5, and then that's part of the reason why we showed the A library to try to bring a lot of those patterns from TypeScript to ES5. And essentially right now that everything in Angular 2 is written with more of a TypeScript mindset, and we're working on bringing better like patterns down to the ES5, so it's not sort of just like forgotten about. And then if you go through our documentation, there's all the TypeScript or ES5 tabs, and we have conversations with each other about like where is this lacking in ES5, how can we have better ES5 support, and just even in our docs alone, because it's big that like I asked the question, how many people here use TypeScript versus ES5, and everyone raised their hand for ES5, so there has to be a really good story for people coming to the site and like learning from what they know right now, and then if they see TypeScript and think it's great, move on to that. But you have to work with what you know today, so we're definitely working on that.
So one thing I'd like to add to that is that obviously everyone knows ES5, and people are going to come through that channel, and they're going to learn Angular and probably anything else right now. One thing that we're working on right now is explaining the value of switching to TypeScript. So it's not very clear when you come to the website. We're still working on it, and we're going to be adding a lot of stuff. But we've spent all this time, pushing TypeScript because we do think there's a ton of value there. We just haven't done a great job explaining it yet. That's something we plan to do in the future, so that we can encourage people that are coming from the ES5 background, which is everyone, the benefits of moving over and help them make that transition.
I'm honored. All right, back on the topic of testing. We've been doing a lot of protractor testing at my company lately, and we've had some issues with getting a little too deep into our end-to-end tests and trying to test everything, and then when anything changes, you got to go back and change every single little thing. And I was just curious to what degree you unit test and what degree you do end-to-end testing, and where you kind of draw the line on which one stops and which one starts, if that makes sense.
Who's our testing expert on the panel here? Are you asking like in the core of Angular, how do we draw the line, or how do we do it? I don't really know a good litmus test for deciding like what volume of unit or what volume of E2E tests you should be writing versus unit tests. I mean, any feature we add, we make sure it's at least got reasonable unit test coverage. I don't think we do much actual E2E other than benchmark tests in the framework right now for the Angular 2 core. So E2E testing usually comes when features are fully baked and there actually is an end-to-end story. A lot of the features now are being developed and somewhat unit tested in a vacuum, and then as things more come together, then add unit tests or add E2E tests that can test that everything plays well together. Beyond that, I don't know a good way of describing how to approach it. Julie Ralph would be a good person to ask about that. She makes Protractor and thinks a lot more about this. Mishko and Igor are also big into testing practices.
I can just speak on it very broadly. It's generally the unit testing for us is a little cheaper and faster, so we can do that. And the end-to-end testing is a little bit more expensive. So looking at that, end-to-end test things that we think could have a critical impact and could actually break things for a user. And you can write, I would say the majority of the testing, at least for me, and I know that's going to be different for other people, is unit testing, which comes a little cheaper. And then if I'm doing an end-to-end test, making sure there's a good reason for that, because I might not be able to end-to-end test everything.
I can kind of speak what we did with Falcor, which is we primarily focused, we broke things apart into pretty cleanly defined modules is a very good step for unit testing, and just unit test the crap out of those. And really the connection points become very little between modules. And so, I mean, if we have one specific thing we test here, we don't need to have an integration test to be like, do you really do that? Do you really do that for all the potential cases that you can call into that from another module? And so kind of reducing the superset of doing the exact same tests over and over again is, integration tests are really hard to do, they're really lengthy, and it's really easy to test redundantly. And so finding the right places to test is kind of the magic to it, I guess.
Anyone else? All right, thanks panel. Go ahead and take off.